I was standing in my driveway with a snow shovel in my hand, back already aching, breath coming out in thick white clouds, when a woman in a puffy red coat marched across the street and handed me an envelope. Not a wave, not a "hey neighbor, rough storm, huh?" Just an envelope thrust at me like I owed her money. I looked down at it, then back up at her, and she turned and walked away without a single word. That's when I knew Nancy Blankenship had done something. I'm Rob Keller, and I've lived in the Pinecrest Meadows HOA community for going on 6 years now. 6 years of quiet evenings, decent neighbors, backyard barbecues, and exactly 2 run-ins with the HOA before this particular morning. The first run-in was about my mailbox being the wrong shade of beige. The second was about my Christmas lights being up 4 days past the HOA-approved removal date. I handled both of those like an adult, made the changes, moved on. I figured that was the deal you made when you bought into a neighborhood like this. You follow the rules, they leave you alone. What I did not figure into that deal was Nancy Blankenship deciding that a foot of fresh snow falling overnight somehow created an opportunity for her to ruin my morning. Let me back up a little bit. It was a Thursday in late January, and the forecast the night before had said 6 to 8 inches. We got closer to 12. I woke up at 6:30 in the morning because my dog Biscuit was going nuts trying to look out the window at the white wall that had appeared where my backyard used to be. The temperature outside was sitting at about 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill was bringing that down to somewhere around 0. Classic Midwest winter, the kind that makes your face hurt if you stand still for more than 30 seconds. My driveway is about 40 feet long. Not massive, but not small either. It connects to a 2-car garage, curves slightly to the left, and borders a strip of sidewalk that runs along the front of my property. Under the HOA rules for Pinecrest Meadows, homeowners are required to clear their driveways and the adjacent sidewalks within 24 hours of a snowfall ending. I knew this rule. I had read the rule book when I moved in because I'm the kind of person who actually reads those things so I don't get blindsided later. The snow had stopped falling around 5 in the morning, so technically I had until 5 the following morning to clear everything. That's 24 hours. That's the rule. I was outside by 7, shovel in hand, because I needed to get my car out before noon to make it to a contractor meeting across town. The driveway wasn't going to clear itself, and the snow was heavy and wet, the kind that sticks together and packs down if you don't get to it fast. I had already done about a third of the driveway, working my way down from the garage toward the street, when the woman in the red coat walked over and handed me that envelope. I tucked the envelope under my arm, kept shoveling for another few minutes just to process what was happening, and then leaned on the shovel and opened it. It was a cease and desist letter. I am not making that up. A formal cease and desist letter, printed on Pinecrest Meadows HOA letterhead, signed by Nancy Blankenship in her capacity as HOA Compliance Coordinator, informing me that I was in violation of HOA Community Standard 14.7, which pertained to, and I am quoting directly here, unauthorized removal, relocation, or redistribution of common area snow in a manner that encroaches upon shared community drainage easements. I read it 3 times. Then I looked at my driveway. Then I looked at the small pile of snow I had pushed to the side of my driveway, which is exactly where snow goes when you shovel a driveway. There's a strip of grass between my driveway and the neighbor's property, maybe 4 feet wide, and I had been pushing the snow there, like every person on the planet does when they shovel, like I had done every winter for 6 years without a single complaint. The letter also included a notice that I was required to cease all snow removal activity immediately pending a compliance review, and that failure to comply within 30 minutes would result in a fine of $250 per additional hour of noncompliance. I stood there in the 14-degree cold, holding this piece of paper, snow shovel in one hand, completely baffled. The storm had dropped a foot of snow. My car was buried. I had to be somewhere in a few hours. And Nancy Blankenship, who I could now see watching from the window of her house across the street, had decided that right now, right in this moment, was the time to play hardball. Now, here is what most people don't know about me. By day, I work in property management, mostly commercial stuff, but I spent several years earlier in my career working alongside real estate attorneys on HOA disputes specifically. I've read more HOA governing documents than I can count. I know what's enforceable and what's theater. And I knew, standing there in the snow with snot starting to freeze on my upper lip, that this letter was theater. But I also knew that if I was going to fight it, I needed to be smart about it. First things first. I took my phone out of my coat pocket and took a clear photograph of the letter in my hand, driveway visible in the background, snow everywhere, timestamps showing on the photo. Then I took a wide shot of the whole scene. Then I went inside, made a coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table to actually read my HOA governing documents. The thing about HOA rules is that they only have power if they're properly enacted. And Community Standard 14.7, the one Nancy was citing, had a specific reference number that I could trace through the documents. I pulled up the digital copy of the Pinecrest Meadows governing documents on my laptop and searched for 14.7. What I found was interesting. The standard she was citing was an amendment. It had been added to the community standards 18 months ago, which meant it had to have been formally voted on and approved by the HOA board. I went to the HOA website, which Nancy herself maintained because she had appointed herself webmaster in addition to being compliance coordinator, and I looked at the meeting minutes from the period when 14.7 would have been voted on. The minutes were posted because state law required them to be posted, but they were incomplete. There was no recorded vote for the adoption of 14.7. There was discussion of it mentioned in the notes from a June meeting, but no formal motion, no second, no recorded vote outcome. If there was no recorded vote, the amendment might not have been properly ratified. And if it wasn't properly ratified, it wasn't enforceable. I sat back in my chair and drank my coffee slowly, letting that sink in. I also thought about the specific language of the letter. It accused me of improperly relocating snow onto a shared community drainage easement. I knew exactly where the drainage easement in our neighborhood was because I had read the plat when I bought my house. The drainage easement runs along the back of every property in the neighborhood, not the sides, not the front, the back. The strip of grass between my driveway and my neighbor Gary's property was not a drainage easement by any stretch of the legal definition. It was just a strip of grass. So the letter was citing an improperly ratified rule and misidentifying the location of an easement that I wasn't anywhere near. I finished my coffee and put my coat back on. Then I went outside and finished shoveling my driveway. I want to be absolutely clear about why I did that. I wasn't being defiant for the sake of being defiant. I was acting within my clearly established legal rights. The rule Nancy was trying to enforce was unenforceable. The easement she referenced didn't exist where she said it did, and I was well within my 24-hour window under the actual rules. I had every legal right to clear my own snow. Also, my car was still buried and I had a meeting. I worked steadily through the rest of the driveway, and by about 9 in the morning I had it fully cleared. I also cleared my sidewalk, salted everything, and knocked the ice off my front steps because that's just what responsible adults do in winter. The temperature hadn't climbed above 18 degrees by that point, and the cleared concrete was already starting to develop a thin layer of refreeze, so I put down an extra layer of ice melt for good measure. I could see Nancy's curtain moving the entire time. About 20 minutes after I finished the driveway, a white sedan with Pinecrest Meadows HOA printed on a small magnetic sign on the door pulled up in front of my house. A man got out, which surprised me because Nancy usually operated alone, and he walked up my newly cleared driveway with a clipboard. He was probably in his late 40s, wearing a fleece jacket and looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. He introduced himself as Derek Paulson, HOA compliance officer, and told me he was there to document the ongoing violation. I said, politely but clearly, "What violation specifically?" He looked at his clipboard. He said Community Standard 14.7, unauthorized snow redistribution onto a drainage easement. I asked him to show me on the plat where the drainage easement adjacent to my property was located. He blinked. He said he didn't have the plat with him. I said I had it. I'd printed it out about an hour ago. Would he like to see it? Derek Paulson looked like a man who had not expected this interaction to go this way. He said he'd have to defer to the HOA board on specifics. I asked him if he was aware that Community Standard 14.7 did not appear to have been formally ratified with a recorded vote at any HOA board meeting, and that under state law and the community's own bylaws, amendments required a recorded vote of the board to be enforceable. He stared at me for a few seconds. Then he said he'd have to refer this back to the board. I said that was fine. I also told him that I had photographs documenting the current condition of my property, the letter that had been delivered to me while I was actively in the process of complying with the actual enforceable rules, and a printed timeline of the snowfall and my clearing activity that established I was well within the 24-hour window. Derek Paulson wrote something on his clipboard, said thank you, and left. I went inside and turned the heat up to 72 because I was absolutely frozen. Here is where things start to escalate, because apparently Nancy Blankenship does not take, "I'm going to challenge this legally" as an answer. By that afternoon, two things had happened. First, I got an email from the HOA board, specifically from Nancy acting in her capacity as compliance coordinator, informing me that my failure to comply with the cease order constituted a separate violation, and that I was now being fined $500. The fine had apparently doubled because I had continued clearing after the 30-minute window in the original letter. $500 for shoveling my own driveway during a snowstorm. Second, my neighbor Gary, who lives on the side where that strip of grass is, called me and said Nancy had knocked on his door and told him that I had been illegally dumping snow on his property and that he might want to consider filing a complaint. Gary is a retired high school principal and has approximately zero tolerance for nonsense. He told Nancy that the snow was against his fence, not in his yard, and that he couldn't care less, and then he closed the door in her face. He called me mostly to warn me, and also because he found the whole thing pretty funny. He did mention, though, that Nancy had also been going around to a few other neighbors trying to drum up support for some kind of community petition against me. That second part was new information, and it changed my approach slightly. I called my neighbor on the other side, a woman named Carol who was about 65 and had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Carol confirmed that Nancy had knocked on her door too, told her I was violating HOA standards and creating drainage problems that could damage the whole street, and asked if Carol would sign a petition supporting stronger enforcement action. Carol had also said no, and Carol also called me to tell me about it. What Nancy apparently didn't know or didn't think about was that I had a pretty good relationship with most of my neighbors. I'd organized a neighborhood cleanup 2 summers ago. I helped Gary with his gutters last fall. I shoveled Carol's driveway when she had a hip replacement 2 winters back. I wasn't some isolated figure that Nancy could easily build a narrative against. The people she was going to, they already knew me. But the petition thing, the going door to door trying to organize people against me, that struck me as potentially crossing a line. Not just bad behavior, but potentially something that had a specific label attached to it under HOA law. Specifically, if she was a board officer using her official position to solicit community pressure against a homeowner for exercising their legal rights, that looked a lot like abuse of authority. Depending on the specifics, it could also look like harassment. I decided it was time to do a few things at once. I sat down and wrote a formal response letter to the HOA board. Not just to Nancy, but to all 5 board members, addressed individually by name and sent via certified mail to the HOA's registered address, which under state law had to be a verifiable physical address. In the letter, I contested the fine on the following grounds. 1. Community Standard 14.7 lacked a verifiable ratified vote per the HOA's own bylaws and was therefore unenforceable. 2. The drainage easement cited in the original cease letter was misidentified and did not exist at the location described. 3. My snow clearing was performed within the HOA's established 24-hour window and therefore was in full compliance with the actual enforceable rules. And 4. The cease and desist letter had been delivered to me mid-activity without any prior warning, notice, or opportunity to cure, which violated the HOA's own enforcement procedures as described in Section 8 of the governing documents. I asked for a formal board hearing within 14 days, which I was entitled to under the bylaws. I also requested, in writing, the complete meeting minutes from all board meetings for the past 2 years, the complete voting records for all amendments adopted in that period, and the professional credentials and licensing status of the compliance officer who had visited my property. All of these were public record under the HOA's governing documents and state law. Then I went around to a few neighbors myself, not to build a campaign, but to ask a specific question. Had any of them received fines or cease letters in the past year that seemed unusual, or had they had any experiences with enforcement that felt disproportionate or unfair? What I found out over the next couple of days was eye-opening. Marcus from 3 houses down had received a $200 fine last spring for parking his truck in his own driveway at what Nancy deemed an improper angle. He had paid it because he didn't know he could contest it. A woman named Teresa from the cul-de-sac had received a fine for having the wrong color mulch in her garden beds. She had also paid it. A couple named the Hendersons, who lived right next to Nancy, had received 3 fines in the past year alone for various things, including a fence height discrepancy that was less than an inch, a garbage can that was visible from the street on a non-trash day, and a holiday decoration that was put up 2 days before the HOA's approved display window opened. They had paid all 3 fines. In each case, the fines had been issued by Nancy Blankenship as compliance coordinator. In each case, the homeowner had paid without contesting because they didn't want the hassle. I did some quick math. The fines I knew about from just talking to a handful of neighbors totaled over $1,400. And these were just the ones I knew about from 2 days of casual conversation. The neighborhood had 83 homes. If Nancy had been operating this way across the whole neighborhood for the past couple of years, the numbers could be significantly higher. That was the moment I started wondering where those fine payments actually went. HOA fines are supposed to go into the community fund. Under the governing documents, that fund was supposed to be used for things like landscaping of common areas, maintenance of the neighborhood entrance sign, and snow removal from common walkways. I had seen the entry sign. It looked fine. The common walkways got plowed by a contracted service, which the annual dues covered. So what was the fine money being used for? I submitted a formal records request to the HOA, again in writing, certified mail, asking for a full accounting of fine revenue collected in the past 2 years and the corresponding disbursements from the community fund. The board had 30 days to respond to that request under state law. In the meantime, life continued and winter continued, because January in the Midwest doesn't take breaks for personal drama. We got another storm the following week. Not as big, maybe 4 inches, but it came with a wind that pushed the snow sideways and piled it up against anything vertical. My front steps looked like a small mountain range by the time it stopped. I went out and cleared everything again, same as before, took photographs first and after for documentation, logged the times, and stayed completely compliant with every actual rule in the book. My next-door neighbor on the other side, A younger guy named Pete, who had moved in about a year ago, was outside at the same time trying to manage his own walkway. He was using one of those small battery-powered snow blowers that was clearly underpowered for this amount of snow and was losing the battle pretty badly. I finished my own clearing, then walked over and offered to help with mine, the big gas-powered one I kept in the garage. We cleared his walk and driveway in about 15 minutes together. Pete mentioned that Nancy had knocked on his door too, the same door-to-door campaign. He said she had told him I was a problem homeowner who was making things difficult for the whole community. He had smiled and nodded, and then called me as soon as she left. What Pete also told me was that he had a security camera on his front porch, the kind that records continuously to a cloud, and that it had captured Nancy making her rounds through the neighborhood on the day she delivered my letter. He offered to share the footage with me if I ever needed it. I said I might take him up on that. I noted it for later. The board had not yet responded to my formal letter contesting the fine or my records requests. The 14-day window for the hearing request was approaching. On day 12, I got a response, not a hearing notice. A letter informing me that my hearing request had been reviewed and that the board had determined the request did not meet the criteria for a formal hearing because the violation in question was classified as a minor compliance matter. The letter was signed by Nancy Blankenship. There was a problem with that. Under the HOA bylaws, any fine over $100 automatically qualified for a formal hearing upon request by the homeowner. The fine I had been issued was $500. My request clearly qualified. Nancy, acting as compliance coordinator, had denied a hearing request that she was not empowered to deny, and that clearly met the qualifying criteria. That was a violation of my rights under the governing documents. And under state HOA law, a board member who improperly denies a homeowner's procedural rights can be personally liable, separate from the HOA's liability, for damages and attorney's fees if the matter goes to litigation. I wrote back the same day, again certified mail, stating clearly that my request met the qualifying threshold and that the denial was improper per Section 8.3 of the bylaws. I again requested the formal hearing and stated that if the hearing was not scheduled within 7 additional days, I would be pursuing remedies through the state HOA regulatory board and through civil court. I also, on the same day, filed a complaint with the state's HOA regulatory authority. In my state, the regulatory board handles complaints about board officers abusing authority, improperly enacted rules, improper denial of homeowner procedural rights, and financial mismanagement. I filed on all 4 grounds and attached copies of every piece of correspondence, the original cease letter, the fine notice, my response letters, and the board's improper denial. Then I called an attorney. Not because I needed one for what I'd done so far. I was handling the procedural stuff pretty well on my own, but because I wanted a consultation to understand my options if this went further. The attorney I reached, a guy named David Marsh who specialized in HOA and property law, reviewed what I sent him and told me I had a very strong position. He said the unratified rule issue alone was likely fatal to the fine, and that the improper hearing denial added a layer of procedural misconduct that made the HOA's position worse. He also said something that stuck with me. He said in his experience, when HOA officers start issuing fines in large numbers for minor violations and denying hearings, it almost always comes back to money, either personal financial benefit or covering up financial irregularities. He suggested the records request I had already filed was exactly the right move. He offered to write a letter to the board on firm letterhead at a flat fee. I said let's hold that in reserve and see what the records request turns up. I did not have to wait long. On day 20 of the 30-day window for the records response, I received a thick envelope from the HOA. Inside was a partial financial statement, emphasis on partial, covering about 14 months of the 2-year period I had requested. The fine revenue line was interesting. In the first year, it showed about $3,000 collected. In the second year, it showed approximately $8,000 collected. That was a significant jump for a neighborhood where the rules hadn't materially changed. More interesting was the disbursement side. Common area landscaping, plowing contract, insurance, all normal. But there was also a recurring line item labeled administrative and compliance operations that had gone from about $400 annually to just under $4,000 in the more recent period. There was no further breakdown of what that line item covered. I brought those numbers to David Marsh, the attorney. He said administrative and compliance operations is exactly the kind of vague label people use when they're moving money somewhere it shouldn't go. He said I should request an itemized breakdown of that line item specifically. I submitted the follow-up request the same day. I also talked to Marcus, Teresa, and the Hendersons, and a few other neighbors I'd connected with through the process, and put together a collective accounting of fines we could personally verify had been paid. Between us, we could document over $4,000 in fines paid to the HOA in the past 2 years. We started a shared document so we could track it properly. It was now the first week of February. We'd had 3 snowstorms in the past 2.5 weeks, and the neighborhood looked like a snow globe. The roads were icy most mornings. The HOA's contracted plowing service was actually doing a decent job on the common walkways, but individual driveways were an ongoing battle. My gas-powered snow blower had become something of a community resource at that point. I'd helped Pete, helped Carol, helped the Henderson family when their car was completely buried after the 3rd storm. Nobody asked. I just did it because that's what you do when you live in a community. Nancy, I noticed, did not come out to help anyone. She did come out to photograph Marcus's driveway once, on a morning when he hadn't yet cleared it but was clearly still within the 24-hour window. She stood on the sidewalk with her phone taking pictures of his house in the cold, which was a little alarming to watch. Marcus called me from inside his house while this was happening. I told him to document that she was doing it, time and date, and he said he'd already grabbed his phone. This is also when Pete's security camera footage became relevant. Pete had mentioned the camera weeks earlier, and I had filed it away. But with Marcus's situation developing, and with what was now a growing pattern of Nancy using her official position to monitor and photograph homeowners' properties in an intimidatory manner, I reached out to Pete again and asked if he'd be willing to pull the relevant footage from the day Nancy had been doing her neighborhood rounds. He pulled it and shared it with me the same afternoon. The footage was clear and time-stamped. It showed Nancy going door to door, yes, but it also showed something I hadn't known about. At one point, Nancy had walked up to the Henderson house, and when she found nobody answering the door, she had walked around to the side of their property and appeared to be looking through a side gate into their backyard. She stood there for a couple of minutes before leaving. That was not related to any compliance function. There was no rule about what your backyard looked like in winter under any version of the HOA standards. What she appeared to be doing was just snooping. I saved the footage to my own cloud storage and kept it documented. The hearing I had been denied was still not scheduled. Day 19 of the 7-day extension I had given them. I contacted David Marsh and authorized the firm letter. It arrived at the HOA's registered address on a Tuesday. I know because I sent it certified and tracked it. The letter from Marsh Law was professional, specific, and did not leave a lot of wiggle room. It laid out the procedural violations, cited the specific bylaw sections, cited the relevant state statutes, and informed the board that my client was prepared to pursue civil remedies including attorney's fees and regulatory action if the matter was not resolved, specifically by scheduling the formal hearing, dropping the unenforceable fine, and providing the complete financial records within 10 business days. Within 48 hours, I received a phone call from a board member I had never spoken to before. His name was Walter Greer, and he was the board president. He sounded tired and a little embarrassed, which I thought was appropriate. He said the board had been reviewing the situation and wanted to discuss a resolution. I said I was happy to discuss it. I also said I wanted the discussion on the record, so could we please put it in writing? He agreed. The written communication that followed was very revealing. Walter explained that the board had, at Nancy's strong recommendation, adopted several new compliance standards over the past 2 years, and that Walter himself was now acknowledging uncertainty about whether all of them had been properly voted on and documented. He said Nancy had been managing the compliance process very independently, and that the full board had not been closely involved in the specifics. There it was. Nancy had been running the compliance operation essentially solo, issuing fines under rules that may not have been properly enacted, and the rest of the board had apparently just trusted her to handle it. Walter said the board wanted to do a full internal audit. I said that was a good start. I also told him about the pattern I had documented, the fines paid by multiple homeowners for questionable violations, the vague, administrative and compliance operations, line item in the financials, and the absence of detailed records for that line item. I told him I thought the board had a responsibility to its members to understand where that money had gone. There was a long silence on Walter's end. Then he said he thought the board might need to bring in an outside accountant. I said I thought that was an excellent idea. The outside accountant was brought in within 2 weeks. She was a certified public accountant named Harriet Dunn, hired by the board with the consent of the full membership, which was notified by email. Harriet was given full access to all HOA financial records. What Harriet found, over the course of about 3 weeks of work, was a financial picture that was not pretty. The administrative and compliance operations line item had been used to pay for, among other things, a premium HOA management software subscription that Nancy had signed up for, a set of office furniture for the home office from which Nancy conducted her compliance activities, several charges from an office supply store, a printer, multiple reams of paper and ink cartridges, and most significantly, a recurring monthly payment to a company called Blankenship Property Consulting LLC. Blankenship Property Consulting LLC, Nancy's last name. The payments to Blankenship Property Consulting LLC totaled just over $6,000 over the 18-month period Harriet was able to audit. There was no board vote authorizing those payments. There was no contract on file. There was no service description. The payments appeared to have been approved by Nancy herself in her capacity as compliance coordinator, routing community funds to a company she owned. That is called self-dealing. In many states, depending on the specifics, it can also be called embezzlement. Walter Greer called me when he got Harriet's preliminary findings. He said the board was meeting that evening and that they would be contacting the authorities. The police arrived at Nancy's house on a Thursday evening. I know because Carol called me, and I could see the patrol car from my front window. There were 2 officers. They were there for about 45 minutes. Nancy was not arrested that night, but she was informed that she was under investigation and that she should not destroy any documents or financial records. She was arrested 3 weeks later, after the investigation was completed, on charges of misappropriation of funds and breach of fiduciary duty. Both are serious charges. The DA's office had enough of a paper trail from Harriet's audit and the HOA's own records to move forward. In the meantime, the board had already taken several steps. Nancy was removed from her position as compliance coordinator at an emergency board meeting by unanimous vote of the remaining 4 members. All outstanding fines issued under Community Standard 14.7 were voided, as the amendment was confirmed to have never been properly ratified. The board issued a formal written apology to every homeowner who had paid a fine related to that rule or any other unratified standard, and committed to a review of all fines issued in the past 2 years. My $500 fine was voided within days of the initial board contact. I never paid a cent of it. The HOA also agreed in writing to reimburse Marcus, Teresa, the Hendersons, and the other neighbors I had documented for the fines they had paid under the questionable standards. The total reimbursement came to just under $4,000, which the HOA covered from its reserve fund pending the outcome of the financial investigation and any potential recovery from Nancy. Nancy's attorney worked out a deal with the DA's office over the following months. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of misappropriation, paid back the full $6,000 in restitution to the HOA Community Fund, received 2 years of probation, and was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state. She also resigned from all HOA positions, which at that point was somewhat redundant given that she'd been removed, but it was part of the record. The community met in March for a special general membership meeting. It was the first time in 2 years that a meeting had been attended by more than 20 people. There were close to 50 homeowners there, crowded into the clubhouse at the front of the neighborhood, coats still on because the heat in that little building wasn't really built for that many people. There was coffee and someone had brought cookies, and despite the circumstances it felt weirdly like a neighborhood party. Walter Greer gave a full presentation of what had happened, what the audit had found, and what steps the board was taking going forward. He was honest about the board's failure to adequately oversee Nancy's activities and took responsibility for that. He said the board was implementing a new policy requiring full board review and approval of any fine over $50, requiring all financial disbursements over $200 to be approved by at least 3 board members, and requiring all meeting votes to be formally recorded and posted to the community website within 7 days. He also said that the board was opening 2 vacant seats and encouraging community members to get involved. I didn't run for the board. That's not my style, but Marcus did, and Carol did. Both got elected with almost no opposition, which I thought was a pretty satisfying outcome. Gary, my neighbor whose fence line had started all of this, came up to me after the meeting with a cup of coffee and said, "You know, I've lived in HOA neighborhoods my whole adult life, and I have never once seen somebody actually push back successfully." He looked genuinely impressed, which from Gary was a significant compliment. I told him I'd just read the documents. The power to challenge bad rules is usually right there in the rules themselves. You just have to know where to look. He laughed and said that was probably the most practical thing he'd ever heard. Spring eventually came to Pinecrest Meadows, as it always does, slow and cold at first, and then all at once with mud everywhere, and the smell of wet ground coming back to life. The snowdrifts that had lined the streets through January and February turned into rivers of snowmelt running along the curbs, and everybody's lawns came back looking a little worse for wear after the long winter. But the neighborhood felt genuinely different. Better. People talked to each other more. There was less of that low-grade tension that I hadn't even fully recognized was there until it was gone. The Henderson family planted flowers along their front walk in April, bright yellow ones, without checking any HOA color standards first. Nobody said a word about it. I ran into Derek Paulson, the compliance officer who had come to my house in the snow with his clipboard, at the gas station a few months later. He looked a little sheepish when he saw me. He said he had been a contracted compliance monitor, and that after everything came out, the board had terminated the contract and decided not to renew it. He was working for a different property management company now. He said, and I appreciated this, that he should have pushed back harder on some of what Nancy had been directing him to do. He'd known it felt off but had told himself it wasn't his place. I told him I understood. Institutional pressure is hard to resist, But I also told him that knowing you have the right to push back is worth something, and that he should remember it for next time. He nodded and said he would. My attorney, David Marsh, sent me a final invoice after the matter was fully resolved. His fees for the letter and the follow-up consultation were about $800. I paid it without hesitation. It was the most satisfying $800 I had ever spent, and when I considered that the alternative might have been a $500 fine, legal exposure on contested fines for years, and a neighborhood community that continued to be systematically shaken down, $800 felt like an outstanding investment. David also told me, and I thought this was worth passing on, that HOA abuse of this kind is extremely common, but also extremely contestable if homeowners actually read their governing documents and understand their rights. Most HOA boards count on homeowners not knowing what they can and can't do. The moment you demonstrate that you do know, the dynamic shifts dramatically. The experience left me with a few things I think are worth passing on to anyone living in an HOA community. Read the governing documents, all of them. It's tedious. Do it anyway. When you receive any fine or enforcement action, immediately ask for the specific rule being cited and verify that it was properly enacted. Not every rule on an HOA's letterhead is a rule that was actually voted on. Request the meeting minutes. They're usually required to be public. Look for votes. If you can't find a recorded vote for a rule, the rule may not be enforceable. Document everything. Photographs, timestamps, certified mail. The moment something feels off, start building your file. Know your procedural rights. Most HOA bylaws give homeowners the right to a hearing for fines above a certain amount. If you're denied that hearing, the denial itself may be actionable. And finally, talk to your neighbors. Not to complain, not to organize a mob, but just to understand the full picture. What looks like a personal dispute often turns out to be a pattern, and a pattern is a lot harder for an abusive authority to dismiss than a single complaint from a single homeowner. I still live in Pinecrest Meadows. I still shovel my own driveway. I still have the same 40-foot stretch of concrete that curves slightly to the left and connects to my two-car garage. In winter, I still pile the snow on the strip of grass between my driveway and Gary's property, because that is where snow goes when you shovel a driveway, and because there is no properly enacted rule, no legitimately voted-on community standard, no valid drainage easement designation that says otherwise. Biscuit still goes nuts at the window every time it snows. I've started letting him out in the backyard to run around in the fresh snow before I start shoveling, which I highly recommend if you have a dog, because the pure joy of a dog in fresh snow is one of the better things life has to offer. The last time we had a big storm this past winter, I went outside early in the morning before 7, with my shovel and my coffee thermos and my good winter boots. The street was quiet except for the sound of the wind and the distant scrape of someone else's shovel a few houses down. The snow was that perfect undisturbed kind, smooth and white and reflecting the early light, and the whole neighborhood looked clean and peaceful. No one walked across the street to hand me an envelope. No one photographed my driveway from the sidewalk. No one issued me a cease and desist for the way I was piling snow. I cleared my driveway in about 40 minutes, helped Carol with her walk since she asked me to and her hip had been bothering her again, waved to Marcus who was out battling his own driveway with a new heavy-duty snow blower he'd bought after all this, and went inside to make breakfast. The HOA, the functioning, legitimate one, sent out a reminder email that week about the 24-hour snow clearing window. Informational only. No threats. No fines pending. Just a neighborly reminder that they hoped everyone was staying safe and warm, which is all it ever needed to be. Nancy Blankenship's house sat on the market for about 5 months before she sold it and moved out of the neighborhood entirely. The new owners are a young couple with 2 small kids who have already introduced themselves to everyone on the block and asked if anyone knew good spots for sledding nearby. Marcus took them to the hill in the park at the end of the road and came back looking like he'd had the best afternoon of his year. I stood at my window watching the street, Biscuit pressing his nose against the glass beside me, and thought that this is what a neighborhood is supposed to feel like. Not a system of fines and threats and compliance inspectors with clipboards showing up in your freshly cleared driveway. Just people living next to each other, helping each other out in a snowstorm, and trusting that the rules they share exist to protect everyone rather than to enrich one person with a compliance coordinator title and a suspiciously vague LLC. The whole thing started because I was mid-shovel in a foot of fresh snow when somebody handed me an envelope. I could have just paid the fine. I could have stopped shoveling and waited for the compliance review and probably eventually paid the $500 and written it off as the cost of HOA living. A lot of people do exactly that, and I understand why, because fighting it seems exhausting and uncertain, and who has the time? But here's the thing. I knew the rule was fake. I knew the easement was fake. And once you know that, once you know you're being pushed around by someone who's counting on you not knowing your own rights, walking away starts to feel a lot worse than fighting back. So I finished shoveling my driveway, and I read the governing documents, and I sent the certified letters, and I hired the attorney when I needed one, and I kept every photograph and every timestamp, and I talked to my neighbors, and I filed the regulatory complaint, and I waited for the financial records to tell the story they were always going to tell. And Nancy Blankenship, who sent me a cease and desist letter while I was mid-shovel in a foot of fresh snow, ended up with a criminal record, a restitution order, a permanent ban from HOA governance, and a sold house in a neighborhood she could no longer show her face in. Sometimes the shovel is mightier than the cease letter. You just have to know which one you're actually holding.